Previously, we have talked about theories that explain persuasion as a process that is mediated by detailed processing of the arguments. However, if we think about the hundreds of advertisements we are exposed to every single day, we might become doubtful. Does anybody really think about the arguments contained in an advertisement about soft drinks or toothpaste? Do these advertisements even contain arguments? And yet, if people were not influenced by them, these companies would not spend millions on their advertising budgets. The answer to these questions is that advertisements often work through processes of classical conditioning or mere exposure. In other words, we are often influenced without a conscious reasoning process. Theories that integrate systematic processing and persuasion processes that are not based on systematic analysis of message arguments are called dual process theories of persuasion. As you can see on the bottom left of your screen, there are two dual process theories of persuasion: the elaboration likelihood model and the heuristic systematic model. There is, however, so much overlap between these two theories and their core assumptions. In the following slides, we will elaborate each theory and discuss how they are similar and differ. Let's begin by discussing the elaboration likelihood model, or ELM. According to the ELM, there are two main routes that play a role in delivering a persuasive message: central and peripheral. The central route is logic-driven and uses data and facts to convince people of an argument's worthiness. This is a direct route to persuasion that focuses on the quality of the information. The central route to persuasion works best when the target of persuasion, or the audience, is analytical and willing to engage in processing of the information. Sometimes we may not be motivated or able to engage in an extensive process of message evaluation. Under these conditions, attitudes will be formed according to the peripheral route to persuasion. This type of persuasion refers to any attitude change mechanisms that does not involve systematic processing. Peripheral route requires less cognitive effort and is less resource demanding. Under this route, the strength of arguments is of little consequence to attitude change. Let's look at an example on your screen. A politician named Leslie is seeking to persuade you to vote for her in an election. She elaborates the plans for her term in office, tells you why she is up for the job, and why the other candidate is not. If you are analytical and motivated to pay attention, you will be able to process the information and therefore develop favorability towards her arguments. This is the central route to persuasion. But if you're not motivated to engage in the information, you will put low efforts to pay attention to the argument and rely on rules of thumb instead. You may pay attention to how she is dressed, how friendly she seems, which then triggers liking and acceptance. This is the peripheral route to persuasion. It is important to note that using heuristics or rule of thumb is just one type of peripheral process in the ELM. Peripheral processes also include other types of less effortful processes that do not involve in-depth examination of persuasive messages, such as mere exposure and classical conditioning. The mere exposure effect suggests that people tend to develop affection for things that they encounter more often. In 1968, a professor called Gelsinger tested this idea by having a student come to class in a large black bag. That is, he came to every meeting in the course in a black bag. At first, the students in the class treated the black bag with hostility, which over time turned into curiosity and eventually friendship. Without any interpersonal interaction and any explanation at all, the mere exposure creates a sense of affinity. Another type of peripheral processing is classical conditioning. It is a learned procedure by which a learning stimulus is paired with a previously neutral stimulus through repeated exposure and reinforcement. An example of classical conditioning is a study conducted by Razran involving political slogans. He gave a small group of 24 adults a list of political slogans, such as "America for Americans," and the other slogans you can see on your screen. He was asked to rate the slogans on a 7-point attitude scale. Then over the next several days, he exposed each participant to these slogans under 3 different conditions, either while eating a free lunch, while smelling foul odors, or a neutral condition. After these exposures to the persuasive communication, or in other words, free lunch, foul smell, or neutral, he then had participants re-rate their attitude towards the slogans. Razran found that people changed their attitudes towards the slogans depending upon the persuasive communication condition. If the slogan was associated with a free lunch, their attitude towards it improved from the pre to post test. If the slogan was associated with foul smells, their attitude became more unfavorable. And finally, for slogans associated in the neutral condition, there was no change. Pretty interesting, right? Now before we get sidetracked, let's go back to talking about the 2 routes. Although both processing routes can shape attitudes, they differ from each other in the nature of the outcomes. In general, attitudes resulting from the central route tend to last longer and are more resistant to counter-arguments. They are more likely to be integrated into one's belief system, making them more predictive of behavioral changes. But because of the high demand of cognitive effort, they are also more difficult to achieve. In contrast, although the peripheral route could cause immediate attitude change, this change fades pretty quickly. Attitudes developed via the peripheral route are less resistant to counter-persuasion attempts and less predictive of behavior. Now there are several factors that influence which route will be taken. As have been explained a few short moments ago, the extent to which an individual engages in the argument can be affected by both motivational and ability factors. When motivation and ability to think are high, individuals are inclined to follow the central route to persuasion. In turn, processing motivation is determined by personal relevance and need for cognition. As the personal relevance increases, the motivation to listen or engage in the argument also increases. Similarly, the higher the need for cognition, the more likely a person is motivated to pay attention. A person's ability to pay attention and engage in the argument is also determined by the resources and skills needed to attend and understand the persuasive message. This includes amount of background knowledge, the presence of distraction, and the amount of time allowed to complete the judgment. In addition, the complexity of the persuasive message and how many times the message is repeated may also affect one's ability to process it. Now let's move on to talk about the Heuristic Systematic Model, or HSM. Similar to the ELM, the HSM suggests that attitudes can be shaped by either more effortful or less effortful thinking. According to the HSM, there are 2 processing modes, the systematic and the heuristic. Systematic processing is comparable to the central route of the ELM. It is more thoughtful, analytically oriented, and requires ample cognitive effort to achieve. In systematic processing, people may apply their existing knowledge or prior experience to validate the message argument. The systematic processing is less likely to happen in situations in which a person knows little about an issue. Meanwhile, heuristic processing is less analytical. Instead of fully examining the actual content of a message, It uses minimal information input to determine the validity of message argument. Persuasion via this processing mode involves rules of thumbs or heuristics. There's actually many types of heuristics. On your screen, we have an example of what is called the length heuristic. The length heuristic states that length indicates strength. Thus, during a multiple choice exam, when you face a very hard question, you would probably choose the longest answer option if you do not know the real answer. Other heuristics you may be familiar with include scarcity heuristic, which suggests that if something is scarce, then it is more desirable to obtain, as well as authority heuristic, which occurs when a user believes the opinion of a person of authority just because the individual is an authority figure, and availability heuristic, which allows one to judge a situation on the basis of the examples of similar situations that come to their mind. Another thing to note about the HSM is that it proposes that both heuristic processing and systematic processing can happen independently of each other. But the two processing modes can also act simultaneously and interact with each other, or termed as co-occurrence. Whether the two processes occur independently or interdependently is determined by two factors. First, the consistency between the implication of heuristic cues and message content, and secondly, the ambiguity of the persuasive message. To recap, let's look at the major differences between the ELM and HSM. One fundamental assumption of the HSM is the co-occurrence of the systematic and heuristic processing. In contrast, the early version of the ELM did not explicitly acknowledge a parallel functioning of the central and peripheral processing. Another major difference between the ELM and the HSM lies in the distinctions between peripheral processing and heuristic processing. According to the HSM, heuristic processing depends on the retrieval of heuristics in memory when people are not motivated to fully think about the persuasive messages. However, using heuristics is just one type of peripheral processes in the ELM. Peripheral processes also include other types of less effortful processes that do not involve in-depth examination of persuasive messages, such as classical conditioning, mere exposure, and self-perception. So those are the dual process theories of persuasion. In the next video, we will talk about the elements of persuasion. See you then!